How you doing? I'm Dr. Paul Dyer. We're going to start getting right in here to the healthy mind. How are you doing? Hi, I'm Dr. Paul. Welcome to the healthy mind. We are going to be talking about consciousness today. So, this is going to be, I started it on Monday to discuss what consciousness is. And if you have any questions or comments, just please put it in your comment section there on your comment section, whether you be on Instagram, whether you be on Facebook, whether you be on YouTube, whether you be on Twitter. Consciousness is, I already knew that this is going to stir up some type of feeling in people about how they understand consciousness. And I definitely want to put in like a disclaimer that this is not the only way to think about consciousness. And if you have an idea of how you think of consciousness, please let me know. Put it in the comment box. Maybe I'll try to get to read it, because if I start talking, sometimes I get a little bit wrapped up into my thoughts and things like that. So when we're going to talk about consciousness, how we understand it is that yesterday I talked about the different ideas of how things have looked at consciousness. Today I think I just want to talk, because Friday I'm going to wrap up, and today's already Wednesday, so happy Wednesday, and I forgot to wish people Cinco de Mayo Day. And anyway, so today I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of consciousness and how I understand it just a little bit. And there's different formulas that I know people can look at as thinking about the science aspect of consciousness, and it could be excitable is the best way I could put it. It could because so many scientists have argued over the Einstein's equations or the Rudolf Hogg's definition. I mean, there could be multiple equations or contemplations of how to derive to an understanding of consciousness. And so a lot of the times the consciousness in the science is that they're trying to, it's going to be defined. And we still have we still have a interpretation of how consciousness is defined. Is it defined in the sympathetic waves? But we do know it's a connection. We do know consciousness is a connection, and that is I don't think that's arguable. I don't think it's a connection from the what or the who or the where. If we look at certain formulas, and I keep going back to formulas because when I think of science, I think of space and time, right? And then if you go and because we have space and time, we almost have to have geometry. We almost have to have geometry. And the reason why we got to have geometry, because then we start to so it's S over T. We have to understand what the geometry of space is, and what that means by space is that you are understanding consciousness by just the science portion of it. If you have any comments of what you want to talk about consciousness and how you understand it scientifically, because I'm going to go on to the metaphysics tomorrow, because we have space-time geometry, and then we have space-time geometry, we also have the collapsing of space, right? Because consciousness is usually the organic principle, right? So if we look at it as an organic principle, we still got to look at how the atoms are. And the force. So we have atoms, force equals distribution equal distribution. So, and then once you have Adams force distribution, then you have what you call collapse and the expanding and contracting. So contracting. Now, how does this relate to consciousness? Because if consciousness comes from the original, from the Big Bang, the Big Bang, and then consciousness can be derived from the science of space and time, and then of course you go into space travel. You can go into how you understand the quantum field, because when we are conscious, are we just awake? Between the difference between awake and sleep, you know, if when I am sleeping, like if you close your eyes and you're sleeping, your whole room disappears consciously, because it's the connection. A lot of it has the connection to what you understand, and then the contemplation of how your mind understands it. And that's where the difference comes into how difficult science is. If you have any questions, you want to put into your Instagram or your Facebook or your YouTube or your Twitter, I'll look at them and then we'll try to explain it or go over it, or if you have any ideas about consciousness. So if you're awake and it's understanding and your sleep is understanding, so what is really consciousness? We usually say, and this goes back into what we did last week with the brain theory. If you're going back into consciousness and then you're going back in here in what you call brain waves or brain matter, then you're going into the, you're falling into, now the science is taking you to how the brain regulates, processes, and produces. So that's where the science gets so much of, because we understand what the synapses does. We understand what the sympathetic waves does. We understand, but the one thing we don't understand, this is so confusing to even scientists, is that, when you're seeing something, consciousness seems to always go to what we call the feeling. And that feeling puts us into the one unified field. The one unified field. And if it's a feeling that puts us into the one unified field, when it touches brain matter, when we see an object, we see it first through, we just know it's just photons hitting our retina. That's what we know. It's photons hitting the retina. And when the photons are hitting the retina, then it changes into a chemical reaction. And once it changes into a chemical reaction, then it gets not interpreted by the brain, it gets released now into a three-dimensional form. Now it kicks it off into another part of the brain, which then interprets it. Because remember what I was talking about the other day is that when your brain is developing, it is duplicating a memory from what it's gone through and understand. So the memory, and then that's why I always said the healthy mind is about understanding, and that's why I started the healthy mind. Some people that keep asking, they're like, so what do you think about like Eckhart Tolle's Eckhart Tolle, waving to some people on Instagram, Eckhart Tolle's idea of what consciousness is. And consciousness, and I know I've read some of his books about how it's about just being awakened or awake, or to understand where you are in your principal awake. But that almost goes back into, like, to me, it almost follows like the psychologist of William James, where he touched on feelings, taste, sight, smell, hearing, vision, and we use most of those things that we use that supersedes others is vision and smell, but to be conscious, William James had said that it's more like touch, taste, and hearing, you know. So that brings us into the concept of now, and that again, these theories or these explanations that people have had of consciousness that we have understood where it could be. If you see me looking around, that's why, because I just want to make sure people are not trying to respond on the different formats. So going back into the brain matter, the awake and the sleep, and the understanding of what it is when you see something and how you see it. And that becomes into brain function. We went over brain function and how the brain function and how the cerebellum and the cerebral. Now, the funny thing is that when we talked about neurons, and I mentioned this yesterday, is that we have over 100 billion neurons. Now, the cerebellum, that does a lot of, the cerebellum has more neurotransmitters than any other part of the brain, and it is considered to be unconscious. So it's kind of like, so how does that work? And that has been troublesome to some scientists, because then it brings us back into how we feel about what we're doing, because the cerebellum has a lot to do with just doing the action of, like, you can train the cerebellum. Is more of like you can train the outside, then once you get in, the cerebellum is like kind of like when it gets into the zone, like a basketball player hitting that sweet shot, and so it gets into that zone. The cerebellum just puts you there. The contemplations, I mean the mathematical terms of the decoding, it just knows what to do and how to do it because it sees it, but it's not a conscious state. So, and they say the cerebral is the conscious of the mind, because that's where you have the equation of understanding of where you are and then the central field, right? So we are in understanding consciousness, and the reason why I think I fell back in this, I wanted to talk about this week, and I'm only going to talk about this week because you could talk about consciousness for hours, especially if you're with someone, because we haven't gotten into the gene. Like if you're going, so if space and time and it's collapsed, and this is called, and then you start to get into the Platonic universe, then you're talking about genes or the explosion of genes, and then this will take you over into the question of who developed the genes and who developed the Platonic universe and its universal model, right? Because the anthropic universal model, so you have the anthropic, I'm a horrible speller, anthropic universe, universe. It's really, now you get into multiverses, right? And if you read comic books, then you can understand where the multiverse comes in. And the multiverse means that any possible thing that can happen, and it changes just on the Platonic universal scale of what's being. Okay, let me slow down. Anything can happen in an anthropic universe, meaning it's a multiverse, right? Meaning that the different mass, space over time distribution equal force, right? Because atoms over force, the expanding and contracting, it changes to what could happen. And once you understand the Platonic scale, because remember, in the quantum field, things are fractal. Things don't come into formation, it comes in formlessness, and then it comes into force over time. But not time how we do it, because all things have a force to it. So even if you get into, like, so when you get into what you call the Planck scale, I'll write that down. So Max Planck had talked about how the atomic structure or the atom structure, when you start getting into the quarks and moving down into the scale of, no, Okay, someone had asked, does the scale does consciousness matter to what you understand of the scale? Well, no, it doesn't, because whatever you understand of what's happening is still happening. It things don't happen because you don't understand it. And I think that's where the concept of consciousness gets so confusing. Because if I don't see it, does it happen? Does a tree fall in the forest? Does it make a sound? Well, we know how sound is, and we know that if force meets another force, it creates a vibration. Vibrations is waveform. Waveform, whether you hear it or not, is still a sound. So when you talk about, so when Max Planck was talking about going into subatomic structures, down into the sub level, there's more space, and I talked about this. There's more space between action and atoms than there is matter. Okay, so then you go space-time, and then you go matter, right? Then you start to have to try to quantify where you are in different parts of your equation, because you can devise any equation you want out of this. You can get to an equational form of velocity scale. How you can add speed into this. So you can add this, and then you can then go with velocity over 1 over f, right? 1 over force. Okay, so you can start putting this into, and just because you can put things in mathematical equation doesn't mean math is, or science is consciousness, but math can explain consciousness on a scale. Because what happens when people have passed on and have died, and we have gangliers, that people have moved their one brain to another part of a transplant, and people have had dreams. Okay, so that is not explained in this, because it's hard to define. It's hard to disassociate what memories are, because I think memory is huge when it comes into consciousness, because when we remember something, we actually reduplicate it. When we have a memory, the brain goes into duplication of what it is that we are remembering. So the memory is charged by our influx of what we're trying to interpret. The brain then reduplicates that. So now, are you conscious of the action of the now, or are you conscious of a memory you had once before? If you don't, I don't like to keep too much of this. I just want to give you a little bit of taste of how consciousness can. Do other animals experience consciousness? As far as what we know, we know that when you come to animals, great question, my wife asked me that question. When it comes to animals and asking about consciousness, so there's 3 levels of animal form that we know. We have the reptilian brain, and then I talked about this the other day, so we have the next level of consciousness, or the next level of awakened brain matter, and that's more of the mammal, right? And then we have what we call humans, could be above that, knowing that we have a perception of who we are, we have an understanding of who we are. Because monkeys have a memory, and they say that's part of the consciousness. Now Penrose, who is probably the one of the leading professors on artificial intelligence, is also saying that you can give consciousness. And I think that's where people are very kind of like, oh no, because if artificial intelligence can develop a consciousness, now we know they can learn, but can they have consciousness? If consciousness is a memory, then a computer has a memory, right? My computer has a memory. My computer can reduplicate something that it's seen before, right? So if it could go through all that, but what does an artificial intelligence doesn't understand? And that's probably the feeling. It probably doesn't understand the feeling of the memory, right? Because you can bring yourself back to a special time and feel it, taste it, smell it. you can trigger all those sensors. Now, then you start falling back into, is it a sympathetic wave that your brain, you're triggering from a chemical reaction that you're triggering? So what is consciousness on a scientific level? Is it just something you can measure? Okay, maybe. Is it something that you can quantify? Okay. Is it something that has a lot to do with the connection between space-time and mass, release velocity, according to the Platonic universe, right? Or the multi-universe, or the genes, and who makes the genes. And then you can get into what you call this God particle, right? And then that's where, okay, even that you explain all this, who defined all this in the beginning? And I think that's where a lot of people get a lot of bit separated between, is God part of your consciousness mind? And I think consciousness is the meaning of memory of an action of now. You know, that's what I think. I mean, we can understand the science, we can understand Max Planck's thing, and it's true, because once we get down into the sub-quarks level of atomic structure, it's a cellular movement. And that's why I like teaching emotional sciences with cellular development and how it affects the body. And again, it goes back to the healthy mind. Are you consciously aware of what we're going through at this time? What type of chemical reaction, force, mass, space, time that you're going through that's creating a velocity in your own universe, your own field, right? Your own field of body that's causing your sickness, that's causing your sadness, that's causing your depression, that is causing you to either be asleep, which you're trying to ignore, or to awaken, which if you're going to awaken, then you're going to awaken the connection, right, to your mind, right? That's what we're trying to do. That's, even after all this explaining of consciousness, I want you to be awake, because there's, you know, in the Vedic sciences, we have awake, we have awakening, we have awake, we have dreaming, and we have higher awake. So there's 4 levels of consciousness in the Vedic sciences. So tomorrow's another day. I wish you stay healthy, stay safe, stay blessed. Make sure you get your meditation in, make sure you get your prayers in, make sure you get your exercises in. If you have any questions that you have later that you come up with, that you want to throw in, I'm doing consciousness again tomorrow. I'm going to do more of the mystical religion side of consciousness. So we'll talk about that. And also, you can always contact me through all my social media. Hope you guys have a blessed day. God bless, good luck, and stay love.